I think moving on now to, I would say it's a panel, but I think it's more of a chat amongst friends. So I'd like to welcome Leanne Kemp back to the stage and Chris Lloyd-Jones, who will be having a bit of a chat about EV charging. Thank you.
Do we sit? You reckon we sit?
You do what you want. Why don't you sit?
I know.
Feels
Work. There you go.
Be careful, don't nod off. It's a very late train. It's quite loud.
I like the last speaker because he hit on the note that we're going to talk about. You know, the whole proprietary hardware world.
Share everything.
I'm getting too old for these challenges in my life, to be honest. So for those that haven't read the summary, we're having a chat up here. Pretty excited about it, Chris. EV charging and the OpenUK blueprint. You're the champion of it.
Yeah, we were somewhat worried when we talked earlier because we were looking through the UN announcement, the Patchwork Kilt panel, and we were saying, will there actually be enough content for us to talk about by the time we get to our panel session?
Oh, come on, you love the sound of your own voice, mate. You'll be right.
That is true. Gives me a lot of LinkedIn posts.
You want to start with a question, or I'll start with a question? Which way do you want to go?
You start, and then we can go through the actual hackathon challenges if we need to as well.
Yeah, let's sort of dive in this EV charging infrastructure. I certainly work in the space with electric vehicle battery passports and have definitely seen the evolution of that under the EU battery directive. And again, there's so much work in this space that is completely closed environment, behind doors, proprietary, and how do we fight to get it into an open environment. But the work that you put on the table around the OpenUK blueprint, just talk a little bit more about that, because being the champion in that work, providing perspectives on the challenges in the current infrastructure, and then I do have a contrarian view. I mean, are we just being too utopic? Will it ever really get to a point where we are true open sourced?
Yep, so this is our third or our fourth time talking about this now, which is why we probably seem a bit like we're about to collapse on the stage. We're expecting to have Lonica here today, who leads on the Open Charge Point protocol. And I think that's where the idea for part of this blueprint came from, because some parts of electric vehicle charging are wholly open source and have been since day one. So OCPP, the Charge Point protocol, does what it says in the tin. It allows you to transmit data on the vehicle charging status, the vehicle battery, to trigger a charger to send power into the car. And no matter what connector you use, whether it's Tesla's, whether it's Type 2 or CCS that we use here in Europe, typically North America and Europe have standardized on totally different connectors. Who would have guessed? But using the OCPP. But when we looked across the landscape, to get to your question, we found that the rest of the landscape, so the design for batteries, the design for the powertrain, the design for the substations, how you engage communities to actually be supported by vehicle charge points, there were no blueprints for that. It was all behind closed doors, and you saw patterns of effectively, apart from in Scotland, actually, funnily enough, you saw people buying up prime land for chargers and not maintaining it. So this was more of a kind of how do we create the standards and also engage with governments to actually try and get them to adopt these standards and these blueprints.
And how far should we go? I mean, when we think about the material footprint of the components of a charging station or a battery itself, do you think that we evolve because of the pressure of circularity or the circular supply chain, or are there other pressures that will enforce us to be able to start thinking smartly about designing in an open way?
So I guess you could be pretty utopian and say that we're trying to do this because we want to live in a circular world, we want to live with the limited resources that we have. At the same time, I think part of this blueprint came about because of the pain points that people picking up EVs were seeing. It sounded like a good way to take the patchwork kilt model and try and see if we could adapt it to other spaces. So the very first way in which we started this was we engaged with a number of different government bodies. So we had BEIS as it was at the time. We had the Welsh Assembly Government as it was at the time. We had Scottish Futures Trust, Northern Irish Executive, and we had tons of people from vehicle manufacturers to chargers to come together and say, what pain points are you seeing? And actually, they led us to many of the different pain points, and that's actually what started the direction of the blueprint.
And so where do we go blueprint 2.0? If we had a crystal ball to cast forward into the future, where would you take us?
I'm actually looking at different battery developments at the moment. So we started with EVs where they were. So that's batteries that are very slow to charge with minerals that are very hard to extract from the ground. And actually, in the year and a half since we started this blueprint, we've seen the development of other battery technologies. They don't exist yet, or they aren't in production yet, but you've got e-fuels, which Germany is pushing for. You've got more regulation coming in. So we're actually looking to do not a revolution, but just an evolution of the blueprint to take into account all the technology changes and regulation changes.
And so that resides and stops at batteries, or do we go then further into turbines and...
We don't quite look at turbines. We look at power substations, the last mile from the substation to the vehicle. Actually, I hadn't even considered that. So that's something which I think when we get the group back together, we should definitely consider. We looked at the typical consultant model of people, process, technology, governance, and tried to look for gaps. We've more been thinking about communities to date. Probably because we were engaged by government organizations, one of their big concerns was planning and regulation, and how can we support local communities. A blueprint that might support someone in, say, the outskirts of Devon or parts of, I don't know, the Hebrides, for example, is not going to be the same as the blueprint that you might adopt in London.
And so, without naming names, but let's name names in the room, when we think about the large OEM, the manufacturers, whether it be battery manufacturers like Cattle or even, OEM car manufacturers, Ford or Renault or even Tesla, who do you think would be the champion out of those proprietary OEM brands to take this forward into an open way? Or do you really feel you're parting the seas?
That's a very difficult question, and this is very much my personal opinion, but I would actually say we're parting the seas a bit. We don't actually have any large vehicle manufacturers on board. We have a couple of chip manufacturers, we've got a couple of powertrain manufacturers, we've got a couple of folks who are involved in actual batteries, but no one from any of the large vehicle organizations.
Fancy that.
Yes.
I was leading some of the work at the Global Battery Alliance, and for the Global Battery Alliance, there were 250 members from Tesla right the way through to large mining companies in Australia and Canada and Glencore, and there were no battery manufacturers in the room. So we all looked at each other at one point in time and said, we're defining the digital battery passport for batteries, but there's no battery manufacturers in the room. Best we rethink that, I think.
Yeah, it's not for lack of engagement, I would say. I think one of the things we tried to do earlier on was invite parties to the table and kind of go, well, if we can't get you to the table, if we have regulators at the table, if we have standards organizations at the table, to an extent, if the regulation is there, then you will likely have to follow. For example, during some of the consultation with, again, the Scottish Futures Trust and BEIS, we found out that if you go to a petrol station right now, most petrol stations have a minimum uptime or service guarantee, which is why you can drive up to a petrol station and know that you can refuel your car. And that's something we take for granted. We just don't think about it. But if you were to do that with an EV charge point, how often are they too slow? They're unavailable, they're broken, they don't work, there's competitors, you need an app. Actually, we found out through engaging a lot of these organizations, it led them to actually put in place consumer regulations for minimum uptime, which I think was around 98, 99% uptime for EVs. We saw GridServe buy out a ton of the charge of the main motorways across England. We saw Scottish Futures Trust divest a lot of their charges and because they felt like they were distorting the market and give them to other organizations. I think you've got Podpoint, a few others picking them up. So yes, we'd like all the parties around the table, but if you're not there, if you're persuasive and there's a good enough blueprint and the government are there to produce regulation, things will still change.
So I'd love a show of hands. How many people in the room have and own and drive an electric car? Oh, so easily more than a third. That's interesting. In Australia, there'd be like 3 hands in the room.
Okay.
There's hope yet. Let's move north. I'm looking forward to 2.0 on the blueprint. Is that something you're beginning work on now, or that's a 2024 initiative?
So that's actually something we're just about to start. So I've had a few people in the room express interest. If you are interested in supporting the blueprint, you can find it on GitHub, or you can find me in the room or get in touch directly. I'm on Mastodon, CLJ, which is like my initials. But we're actually starting with a data challenge on the patchwork kilt blueprint. Then every Friday at the moment, we're going to have 2 calls, one for Patchwork Kilt, one for the EV charging blueprint before we take on any others. And we're going to be treating this like any other open source project. We've got our guide for contributions. You can issue a pull request, raise an issue on GitHub, and just see how it goes. We're OpenUK, the UK organization for open tech and global collaboration, but it wasn't an open source project, which is a little bit of an oversight, and it now is. The data's under CDLA, and the code's under MIT, and it's all human readable.
Need any lawyers? There's a couple over there that got some time up their sleeves. All right. Well, thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yep.
Looking forward to it. Let's talk about the announcement this morning.
Yes.
The UN.
Yes.
Giddy up. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's actually been a very long time coming. We've been speaking with the United Nations, the ITU, and with others to try and put in place a hackathon to actually get these blueprints being off something on a site that, from the usage statistics, no one's really looking at, but it's actually something that's quite useful. Again, a blueprint's there to identify gap analysis. Where do we need people? And I wrote the hackathon challenges before I went on holiday in July, so I'm going to cheat. They're on my iPad. And we're going to be running it across COP28 and doing some kind of prize next year. The challenges are, first of all, heat redirection, using the blueprint to develop open source software to monitor heat generation in data centers and direct the heat towards applications that can provide a value. So beyond the swimming pool and Exmouth example we saw earlier, how can we make sure that heat is a commodity and not a byproduct? Building repurposing. So in a world where remote work and edge computing is effectively causing us to reevaluate urban spaces, develop an open source tool to analyze the data of location, size, power supply, and design solutions to utilize these spaces. Circular supply chain. So manage the life cycle of critical components from reuse and repair to recycling for either the data center or EV charging blueprint, and then identify how those same principles could adapt to other supply chain. And there's 2 more, we're not yet done. EV and transportation for communities. How can we build a solution in line with the rhythm of local communities to make sure that electric vehicle charge points benefit people living near them? To enhance the quality of life for local communities. So supporting local pop-ups, for example, getting people to go into communities they might not otherwise have done to increase foot traffic to retail stores. And then shifting from open source software, our final challenge is around open data. So adopt and mash up the data from either blueprint to reboot our planet. How might you remix the blueprint data, inject updates, create applications? And we've also got a final open challenge, use any component of the blueprint for community empowerment. So there's a lot there.
There is a lot there. There is a lot. If there's any new ideas or a wild card idea, just let us know. Please write through, because we're happy to take a look at those as a part of the challenge, specifically around the timing with COP and the UN. What does this look like practically? What do people do? How do they engage? Where do they reach out to?
So the UN's run a couple of hackathons in the past, and they have a platform that they use for Reboot the Earth. I think it's called Unite IT. I'd have to double check. But in the next month or so, there'll be an announcement on the United Nations website and on OpenUK. That will link to their own hackathon platform. Think of it as the United Nations Dev Post. You'll be able to see the challenges. You'll be able to submit your ideas. The gates will open, as it were. Once you've submitted your idea, then we'll start the time for you to start working on your open source project, be that software, data, or anything in the wildcard category. And there'll be a panel of judges judging each one, judges TBD, and the prize ceremony will take place next year. We're tentatively thinking it will be one of the United Nations Council of Ministers, but that's not confirmed and that's subject to change.
Okay, we won't hold you to it, but I'll remember what you said. So I'm just going to open it up. We've got about 4 minutes left here before we stand in the way of the final hurrah and let the fun begin with alcohol and drinks. So is there any questions in the room, things that you might be curious about, or had any of those wildcard ideas that were running through you? I'm happy to run a mic, need a bit of exercise today. Put your hand up or not. Oh, God, you really, I regret saying this now.
I should have gone with the mic. I feel lazy now. In fact, I'll go to Gadu.
Thank you. My question's on the UN hackathon, that wild category. Wait, who's making the decisions on the topics? Is it UN, right? Because it's all in that, but like, could we put in suggestions?
So the wildcard category at the moment is anything to do with community empowerment. So you can enter anything that relates to community empowerment and involves the blueprints in some way. Cool. Gadi?
Sorry, just a quick question. Curious about the networking. So we've heard about open software, open hardware. It's linking communities who don't have access to network linking. So what's happening in that? I'm just curious.
So in the EV charging blueprint, at the moment, that's actually a gap that we've identified. The blueprint does talk about the standards for networking, but it's identified that there is a gap in the hardware piece. So what the blueprint's trying to do is collate the resources that exist. Where they do not exist, identify gaps to try and inspire open source communities to fill them. OpenUK themselves do not create the open source projects to fill those gaps, but they do engage with foundations like the Linux Foundation to try and get them to start up those projects. Think of us as a bit of an aggregator.
Is there a third in the room, or have we got two and I can drop the mic and be done with it?
Think we're good?
We're done. That's
Cheers,
it,
folks.
Chris.
Thank
Giddy
you.
up.